In the winter of 1973, drivers across the eastern seaboard of the United States waited in lines that stretched for blocks, sometimes idling for hours to receive a few gallons of gasoline. Photographs from that era show a peculiar kind of helplessness, the machinery of the richest nation on earth suddenly paralyzed, not by war on its own soil, but by the decisions of men meeting in conference rooms in Vienna and Riyadh. It was a shock that reshaped everything, from the size of automobiles to the architecture of foreign policy, and for a generation, it burned into public memory, the uncomfortable truth that modern civilization ran on a substance it did not fully control. Half a century later, that lesson is being taught again, only this time the classroom is larger, the stakes more tangled, and the available alternatives fundamentally different from anything that existed in the age of disco and stagflation. On the morning of the 2nd of March 2026, crude oil futures surged between 10 and 13% in the opening minutes of Asian trading. Brent crude, the global benchmark, jolted to roughly $82 a barrel before noon in London and kept climbing through the week. The cause was not abstract or speculative. The United States and Israel had launched military operations against Iran, and within days the conflict escalated into something no energy analyst had fully priced in: the functional closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway between Iran and Oman through which roughly a fifth of the world's daily oil consumption passes on tanker ships. Iran, whose coastline dominates the northern shore of the strait, responded to strikes on its territory by mining approaches, deploying fast-attack naval craft, and ultimately announcing a full closure of the passage. By mid-March, satellite imagery showed tanker traffic through Hormuz had dropped to nearly zero. The International Energy Agency, an organization created in the aftermath of the 1973 crisis for precisely this kind of scenario, convened an emergency session on March 11 and announced the largest coordinated release of strategic petroleum reserves in its 52-year history. 400 million barrels were pledged by member nations, with the United States contributing 172 million barrels from its strategic petroleum reserve, a network of salt caverns along the Gulf of Mexico coastline in Texas and Louisiana, originally hollowed out after the last time the world found itself at the mercy of a geopolitical choke point. The numbers sounded enormous. They were not enough. 400 million barrels, at the rate of global consumption, represented roughly 4 days of the world's oil appetite. If the strait remained closed for weeks or months, no reserve on Earth could compensate. By the end of March, Brent crude had pushed past $90. By mid-April, it touched 97. In the United States, where gasoline prices track crude with a lag of about 2 weeks, the national average at the pump hit $4.13 a gallon, a level not seen since the summer of 2022. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that gasoline prices in March jumped 21% in a single month, the largest such increase since 1967. Consumer inflation spiked accordingly. The Consumer Price Index for March showed an overall monthly increase of 0.9%, the steepest in nearly 4 years, and the annualized inflation rate climbed to 3.3%. Reversing much of the progress the Federal Reserve had painstakingly achieved over the preceding 2 years. But the crisis was not merely an American one. It was, as a CNN headline put it, turning from an oil crisis into an everything crisis. Nations in South and Southeast Asia that depend heavily on imported petroleum, countries like India, Pakistan, Thailand, the Philippines, found their trade balances deteriorating rapidly. Airlines raised fuel surcharges. Shipping costs jumped. Agricultural inputs, from diesel for tractors to petrochemical-based fertilizers, became significantly more expensive within weeks, threatening food price inflation in some of the most vulnerable parts of the world. The architecture of global commerce, built over decades on the assumption that roughly 100 million barrels of oil would move cheaply and reliably each day, revealed the fragility that had always been embedded within it. And it was in this context, against this backdrop of fuel lines and anxiety and the dull arithmetic of geopolitical dependency, that something else began to happen, something that had been building for years but suddenly accelerated with a force that surprised even its most enthusiastic proponents. In March 2026, global electric vehicle sales crossed a threshold that analysts had been watching with careful attention. The data, compiled across dozens of national markets, showed that electric vehicles had reached roughly 27.5% of all new car sales worldwide, a figure that, in the language of technology adoption, corresponds to what sociologists and market theorists call a tipping point, the moment when a new technology transitions from being an alternative to being an inevitability. 39 countries around the world now had an electric sales share above 10%, up from just 4, all in Northern Europe, as recently as 2019. Singapore, a country with almost no domestic energy production, had crossed the threshold. So had Brazil. So had Thailand. The geography of electrification was no longer limited to the wealthy and the progressive. It was spreading into the developing world, driven not by ideology but by cost. The relationship between the oil crisis and the surge in electric vehicle interests was not coincidental, but it was also not as simple as the most breathless headlines suggested. The mechanism worked through several channels simultaneously. The most obvious was the direct comparison at the point of purchase. When gasoline costs $4 a gallon and electricity costs roughly the equivalent of $1 for the same distance traveled, the arithmetic favors the electric vehicle with brutal clarity. Analysis published by several consumer platforms in early April estimated that electric vehicle owners were spending between $100 and $200 less per month on fuel than their gasoline-driving counterparts. At $4 a gallon, a driver covering the American average of roughly 12,000 miles a year in a conventional sedan was spending close to $2,000 annually on fuel alone. The same driver in an electric vehicle of comparable size, charging predominantly at home on overnight rates, was spending roughly $600. The gap had existed before the crisis, but at $3 a gallon, it was easy enough to rationalize away. At $4, and with the specter of 5, the rationalization collapsed. Multiple online car-selling platforms reported sharp increases in searches for electric vehicles beginning in the second week of March. Used EV sales, which had been growing modestly through 2025, surged. Dealership reports from markets as diverse as Germany, Australia, and South Korea all told variations of the same story. Consumers who had been on the fence, who had liked the idea of an electric car but had not felt compelled to act, were now walking into showrooms with a new urgency. The European Business magazine noted that petrol drivers were estimated to be 5 times more exposed to the oil price shock than EV owners, a statistic that, once circulated, had a powerful psychological effect even among those who had never thought of their car choice in terms of risk management. But the most consequential dimension of this shift was not happening in American or European showrooms. It was happening in Shenzhen, in the boardrooms and factories of a company that most Western consumers had barely heard of 5 years ago, but that had become, by early 2026, the most important automaker on the planet by several measures. BYD, or Build Your Dreams, the Chinese manufacturer that had grown from a battery company into a vertically integrated automotive empire, reported that overseas orders had surged to what its executives described as another level since the onset of the crisis. The company's affordable electric models, some priced below $15,000 in Asian markets, offered something that no Western automaker could yet match: genuine mass-market electrification at a price point accessible to the global middle class. Its latest hybrid system, the DMI-5, delivered fuel economy figures that made traditional internal combustion engines look obsolete by comparison, and its fast-charging technology, which the company claimed could add 2 kilometers of range for every second of charging, was addressing the one objection, range and charging time, that had historically kept cautious buyers loyal to gasoline. A parallel was drawn, first in industry analysis and then in mainstream journalism, that carried an uncomfortable resonance for Western automakers. In the 1970s, the oil crisis had created the conditions for Japanese automobile manufacturers, principally Toyota and Honda, to break into the American market with small, fuel-efficient cars that Detroit had dismissed as unserious. Within a decade, those companies had fundamentally altered the competitive landscape of the global auto industry. The question now being asked was whether the 2026 crisis was doing the same thing for Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers, whether the combination of high oil prices, mature battery technology, and overwhelming manufacturing scale was creating a structural advantage that would persist long after the strait reopened and the tankers resumed their passage. The comparison was not perfect. There were significant differences. In the 1970s, there was no policy resistance to Japanese imports beyond ordinary tariff structures. In 2026, Chinese EVs faced a bristling wall of protectionist measures. The United States had maintained a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, originally imposed under the Biden administration and continued under President Trump, who had additionally eliminated the $7,500 federal tax credit for EV purchases and rescinded California's authority to set its own vehicle emission standards. The European Union was conducting its own anti-subsidy investigation. The intent in both Washington and Brussels was clear: to prevent Chinese manufacturers from achieving in electric vehicles what Japanese manufacturers had achieved in combustion engines. Whether these measures would succeed was another question entirely. The irony was sharp and widely noted. At the precise moment when surging oil prices were making electric vehicles more economically attractive than they had ever been, American policy was simultaneously making them harder for American consumers to afford. The elimination of the tax credit added thousands of dollars to the effective purchase price of a new EV. The tariffs, while targeted at Chinese imports, rippled through supply chains that were deeply intertwined. Battery cells, components, raw materials all moved through networks in which Chinese manufacturers played a dominant role. American automakers found themselves caught between a geopolitical imperative to electrify and a trade policy that raised the cost of doing so. A CNN analysis in March described the situation as a car industry trapped between two contradictory political forces: the push of a global oil crisis that rewarded electrification and the pull of a nationalist economic policy that penalized the most cost-effective route to achieving it. Yet the crisis also exposed a set of constraints that no amount of consumer enthusiasm could bypass in the short term. Electric vehicles, for all their advantages, were still manufactured objects that required lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, and a constellation of other materials mined and processed through supply chains that had their own vulnerabilities. China controlled roughly 70% of global lithium-ion battery production and an even larger share of the processing of key minerals. Lithium supplies were adequate for the moment, but analysts at organizations like Wood Mackenzie warned that if EV demand continued to accelerate at the rate the crisis was driving, shortages could emerge as early as 2028, requiring an estimated $276 billion in new mining and processing investment just to keep pace with demand. The world, in other words, was not simply trading one dependency for another. It was potentially trading a dependency on a liquid extracted from beneath the deserts of the Middle East for a dependency on minerals extracted from the salt flats of Chile, the mines of the Congo, and the refineries of Jiangxi province. The electrical grid itself presented a further set of constraints that were easy to overlook in the euphoria of surging sales numbers. Studies published in Nature and by grid operators in the United States, Europe, and Southeast Asia identified a problem that was less dramatic than a closed strait but no less real. The local distribution networks that carried electricity into neighborhoods and homes had not been designed for a world in which a significant percentage of households were drawing the electrical equivalent of an additional house from the SITA grid every night to charge a car. Uncoordinated charging, in which millions of vehicles plugged in simultaneously during evening peak hours, could strain transformers, blow fuses, and create localized brownouts. The solution: smart charging systems that spread demand across off-peak hours, vehicle-to-grid technology that allowed car batteries to feed power back into the network, upgraded distribution infrastructure were all technically feasible but required investment, planning, and time that the sudden urgency of the crisis did not easily afford. There was also a deeper question, one that hovered at the edge of every optimistic forecast about the crisis accelerating the energy transition. It was the question of permanence. In 2008, when oil prices spiked to $147 a barrel during the global financial crisis, American consumers abruptly abandoned SUVs and trucks for smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles. Sales of the Toyota Prius surged. Analysts declared the end of the American love affair with large vehicles. And then, within 2 years, as oil prices collapsed and the crisis faded from memory, SUV sales rebounded and kept climbing to levels higher than before. The pattern repeated with eerie precision: crisis, behavioral shift, recovery, reversion. A Forbes analysis published in early April 2026 argued explicitly that the current boost in EV sales was unlikely to last beyond the Iran war, drawing a direct parallel to the 2008 episode and warning that the fundamental consumer preference for familiar gasoline-powered vehicles had survived every previous oil shock intact. The counter-argument, and it was a strong one, was that 2026 was structurally different from any previous energy crisis in one critical respect: the alternative technology was ready. In 1973, when the Arab oil embargo struck, there was no viable substitute for the internal combustion engine. In 1979, when the Iranian Revolution sent prices spiraling again, electric vehicles were laboratory curiosities with lead-acid batteries and a range of 40 miles. Even in 2008, the first mass-market EVs were years away from production. But in 2026, consumers could walk into a dealership and drive home in an electric car that matched or exceeded a gasoline vehicle in range, performance, comfort, and increasingly price. The technology was not hypothetical. It was parked in driveways. It was accumulating miles on highways. It was being manufactured at a scale of tens of millions of units per year. The question of whether the crisis would produce a lasting shift was not a question about technology. It was a question about whether human behavior, market structures, and political decisions would allow a technology that was already mature to replace one that was already obsolete by most engineering measures. The IEA's April oil market report contained a statistic that crystallized this tension in a single number. For the first time since the pandemic lockdowns of 2020, global oil demand was projected to decline in 2026, not because the world was consuming less energy, but because the combination of high prices and the ongoing displacement of oil by electricity and transport was finally bending the demand curve downward. The agency projected a contraction of 80,000 barrels per day, a small number in the context of a 100 million barrel per day market, but symbolically immense. The first non-recessionary decline in oil demand in the modern era. The world's fleet of electric vehicles, Fortune reported, was already displacing enough oil to account for 70% of Iran's pre-war export volume. The machines that consumers had bought for reasons of economy or environmentalism, or simply because they liked the instant torque, were collectively doing what aircraft carriers and strategic reserves could not: reducing the world's vulnerability to the oldest and most volatile geopolitical lever in existence. None of this meant the transition was painless or equitable. In the United States, the people most hurt by $4 gasoline were overwhelmingly those least able to afford a new electric vehicle, rural drivers, low-income workers, people in regions where public transit was non-existent and the nearest charging station was 50 miles away. The used EV market was growing but remained thin. The average age of a car on American roads was over 12 years, and the vast majority of the existing fleet would run on gasoline for years or decades to come. The crisis was accelerating a transition that, for millions of people, remained out of reach. And the policy choices that might have eased that transition, tax credits, charging infrastructure investment, fleet electrification mandates, had been largely dismantled in the name of deregulation and consumer choice. The paradox was stark. The market signal that most powerfully favored electric vehicles was the one that most powerfully punished those who could not yet access them. In Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, the crisis prompted a different kind of calculation. The Gulf states, whose sovereign wealth funds had spent the better part of 2 decades diversifying into tourism, technology, and renewable energy, watched the oil price climb with the ambivalence of nations that understood both sides of the equation. Higher prices meant higher revenues in the short term, but they also meant faster adoption of the technology that threatened to make those revenues permanently irrelevant. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 program, launched a decade earlier to wean the kingdom off oil dependence, suddenly looked less like a luxury ambition and more like an existential necessity. The crisis was not just a disruption of supply, it was, for the producing nations, a glimpse of the demand side of the ledger, a preview of a future in which the oil they pumped from beneath the desert might find fewer and fewer buyers willing to pay for it. By mid-April 2026, the Strait of Hormuz had entered a cycle of closure and partial reopening that kept markets in a state of sustained volatility. Iran, facing a comprehensive naval blockade by U.S. Central Command, alternated between threatening permanent closure and announcing limited reopenings for commercial traffic, each announcement sending crude prices on sharp oscillations that made planning impossible for refiners and consumers alike. Brent crude, which had touched $97, dropped briefly below 91 on rumors of a diplomatic channel, then surged back above 95 when Iran boarded and seized a tanker. The U.S. Navy fired on and disabled an Iranian-flagged cargo ship attempting to break the blockade. The human cost of the conflict continued to mount, with reports of more than 3,400 Iranian casualties. Against this background of war and volatility and strategic maneuvering, the quieter revolution continued. BYD shipped another container of Atto 3S to a port in Thailand. A family in suburban Munich, calculating the arithmetic on a kitchen table, placed an order for a Volkswagen ID.4. A used Tesla Model 3 changed hands for the third time in its life, this time to a delivery driver in Manchester who had watched his diesel costs double in 6 weeks. A utility in California tested a vehicle-to-grid system that drew power from a fleet of electric school buses during a late-afternoon demand spike. A lithium processing plant in Western Australia broke ground on an expansion that would take 3 years to complete. A congressional subcommittee heard testimony about the state of America's charging infrastructure and the gap between what existed and what would be needed if EV adoption continued at its current pace. No single one of these events was dramatic. None would dominate a news cycle, but taken together they represented something that every previous oil crisis had lacked: a tangible, scalable, already deployed alternative to the substance that had governed the geopolitics of the 20th century and was now, in the 21st, finally encountering the conditions under which its dominance could end. Not through any single policy or any single technology or any single crisis, but through the slow, grinding, accumulating weight of economics, engineering, and the reluctant recognition forced upon millions of people by the blunt instrument of a fuel receipt that the age of oil was not ending because someone had decided it should, but because something better had arrived, imperfectly and unevenly and with its own set of dependencies and vulnerabilities, but arrived nonetheless and was not going back.